Thank you for joining us. We're waiting 2 more minutes for everyone to join in.
Thank you, everyone. I am delighted that you're able to join me in the waning day of Hanukkah for a review of Hanukkah in part, and also ways in which the Hanukkah holiday ties to events in the world today, because one of the remarkable things about the Jewish festivals is that they almost always have a resonance in the events of the world, which is a tribute both to our abilities as human beings to be pattern-making creatures, and also to the remarkable range, variety, and nuance of the holidays themselves. So I'm going to give 3 or 4 points about Hanukkah that I think are worth thinking about, and then talk a little bit about some of the things that have been going on in the world and tie them to the Hanukkah story and the lessons of Hanukkah. And then we'll open it up for questions or comments that you can, I guess, put in the chat, or however Roy wants to manage it. And I want to thank Roy Regev for putting this together, along with Benjamin Glassman and the whole team at Sinai Temple. So I am coming to you, as you may know, from Cambridge, where everything has been calm and copacetic, unlike what you may have heard. None of it. It's all been fine. And we've been lighting our Hanukkah night after night in different places. And Hanukkah itself is actually a slightly more complicated holiday, as is often the case, than we teach our kids about. And the first point to make about Hanukkah, as grown-up Jews and observers of the Jewish people, if you're not Jewish yourself, is that a lot of it has to do with internecine warfare. That is, Hanukkah is not only about the Jews versus the Greeks. It's also about the Jews versus the Jews. And Jews, I know this will shock you, have not always gotten along. And we've had civil wars in our history. And part of the story of Hanukkah is the story of a civil war between those Jews that were Hellenized and essentially wanted to disappear into the larger culture, and those Jews who insisted that Judaism had to endure and ultimately prevail. And we don't obviously spend a lot of time on this when we teach the Hanukkah story, but it's important for us to know, in part because a lot of Jews have a very romanticized view of Jewish history, that the Jews were always unified and always took care of each other until like last Thursday. And, you know, all of a sudden now, or last year, or 5 years ago, and all of a sudden, the Jews have become this group that fights among each other. And you look at Israel and you say, why can't they all be unified? Or you look at American Jewry and say, why can't they all stand together? And the proper historical answer is because they never did. There were times when there was greater Jewish unity, times when there was less Jewish unity. It will not surprise you to know that the greater the external threat, the greater the unity. That's not only a function of Jewish history, I think that's a function of history in general. And there probably is not a single group in the world that doesn't have greater unity when they are faced by a common enemy. I mean, if tomorrow, in the form of science fiction movies, the aliens invaded, the Earthlings would suddenly be unified. Like Russia versus Ukraine would not matter because we all have to fight the aliens. So when the Jews were attacked, it tended to be a moment of greater Jewish unity, but there were always different factions among the Jewish people. And by the way, that goes back as far as we go back, because if you look in the Bible, and you think about Korach's rebellion, that was Jews fighting against Jews, even in the desert, even when they left Egypt. And that's, in a way, I mean, it may be dispiriting about human nature, but it's encouraging about our own predicament, to know that we are not at all unique in Jewish history in fighting with each other. Now, I will say, and we'll come to this, I think, there have been times when we fought better and worse, right? There are times when the disputes have been kept within reasonable boundaries, but I was just on another Zoom before this Zoom, in which we were talking about, it's a separate project that I'm working on, about the diversity of opinion and so on and so forth. And one of the consultants on the panel was talking about the debate in Israel over whether to take reparations from Germany when Israel was first founded. And that debate was so acrimonious and so passionate that in some ways it makes the judicial reform look mild by comparison. In the end, of course, Ben-Gurion, who wanted to take reparations from Germany, prevailed, and they did, but a lot of people in Israel were dead set against taking a single penny from the country that had just tried to destroy them, and you can certainly understand why. And it reminds you that there are real issues sometimes that people have very different principles about that can be defended. And one of the immortal truths of arguments about ethics is, as my brother, the professor of ethics, likes to say, ethical arguments are almost never about right and wrong. They're almost always about competing rights. And the question is, which right do you favor? It's like, when you pull the plug, is it autonomy versus quality of life versus promises of medical care versus, they're always competing rights. And that's what makes ethical dilemmas so difficult. If somebody's right and somebody's wrong, that one's easy. So here too, in Jewish history, there have been debates, and they are almost always between competing factions, both of whom have really solid and strong arguments. And then you have to decide on which side you come. That's point one about Hanukkah, is that Hanukkah is a battle between Jews. Point two is that the Hellenizers were the ones who wanted to assimilate, and that Jews have always, throughout history, even when they were sequestered in ghettos and separate, they have always, in one way or another, fought to resist the allure of the majority culture. And the friendlier the majority culture was to the Jews, the harder it was to resist the allure of the majority culture, which is why when they asked the founder of Chabad, Shneur Zalman of Liadi, if he wanted Napoleon or Russia to win, he said, if Napoleon won, it would be better for the Jewish people, but worse for Judaism. Because Napoleon was going to bring with him enlightenment. And enlightenment meant acceptance, and acceptance meant assimilation. Whereas in Russia, with the Tsar had no desire for the Jews to assimilate, and Judaism would stay stronger. And that's why Judaism tends to, the more religious it is, the more isolated it tends to be in very confined neighborhoods, Mea Sharim, Bnei Brak, Williamsburg, and others, because then the allure of the culture out there is not as strong. And this, by the way, is something that, as you know, is being challenged by the fact that now the culture comes into your home in the form of things like smartphones. But that didn't used to be the case. and the instruments of culture that we had growing up, many of us, like televisions, would never find their way into very traditional homes for exactly that reason. So assimilation, which is something that we struggle with now very much, obviously, in America and throughout the world, and I don't have to give you all the statistics, you know this, is something that they struggled with in ancient Greek times as well. And not only in ancient Greek times, there was one community, a very prominent community of Jews in Alexandria in Egypt, and we don't have any records of persecution, but they disappeared. And the assumption of scholars is that they eventually assimilated into the larger society because they were accepted and embraced. So we have Jews fighting among Jews and assimilation, and then you have the third great theme of Hanukkah, which is Jewish resilience and survival. Because the attempt of the Seleucids, and in some ways it's the first sort of systematic attempt in Jewish history that is directed against Judaism as a religion, as opposed to, oh, this is a tribe that wants the land that we want, was the Seleucid revolt, and was the Maccabean revolt against the Seleucids, because increasingly people wanted to ensure that the Jewish religion ceased to be, since it clashed with their own beliefs, most of which had to do with how much you would worship the king or ruler or pharaoh or potentate of whichever country it was. So I'm going to take all those three themes and now try to make them relevant in a somewhat different way, because really Hanukkah is very poignant this year. And let's start with the thing that Hanukkah taught us, and not only Hanukkah, but surely Hanukkah, is that absent physical force, military force in this world, it is extremely difficult for Jews to sustain their, it's impossible for them to sustain their sovereignty and difficult for them to sustain their existence. For a long time, Jews wielded power in other ways. Jews were middlemen. They used money. They used influence with the court. They used tax base, agriculture, trading, anything they could do in order to not be powerless. But it's still a very tenuous kind of existence, because for the most part, there was no official charter in most of the countries that protected the Jews, which was why England could summarily expel their Jews for 500 years, which they did in the 1100s, and they were not brought back until under Oliver Cromwell, after Charles I was overthrown and executed, and he brought the Jews back into England. And so for hundreds of years in different countries, Jews were thrown out and brought back, and that's because Jews did not have any recourse other than what we might call soft power. And soft power is good when it works, but if the government is resolved against you, soft power is not sufficient to keep you safe and living in a land that wants to get rid of you. What we see in Israel today is a recognition that military force is indispensable to the maintenance of the state. And as often happens, the maintenance of slightly greater military force is not sufficient to maintain your security, right? You're only tempted not to attack that which is much, much stronger than you. If it's a little stronger, as we all know from history, the underdog can win. It happened in the 67 war. It happened in the 48 war. Both times Israel was the underdog and won. When you look at the map, it's still stunning to me that Japan ever won a war against China, right? China's gigantic, Japan is tiny, but such things depend on lots and lots of different factors, not only population. And so Israel has to maintain a huge military superiority in order to ensure its own safety. And this is a lesson that we have learned throughout Jewish history, and certainly from the time of the Maccabees, especially because one of the things that Israel always has to remember is that the potential army against Israel is infinitely greater than the actual army. The potential army is still all the Arab states. It's still a potential army. Yes, there is peace with Egypt now, but peace has ended before. And so Israel can't afford to believe in the good intentions of its neighbors. I think it's pretty safe to say that if the United States disarmed today, we would still be safe against Canada. I still don't think the Canadians would invade. That's just my read of the situation. But Israel doesn't have that luxury of believing that its neighbors don't wish it ill if it were weak. And so the lesson here from Jewish history, again and again, it's the lesson of Purim, it's the lesson of Hanukkah, is that military weakness is a great risk in a world where there isn't a total community of values. And so, again, this is part of what makes it so difficult. You know, I mean, I certainly understand. I said the other day on one of the programs I was on, I think it was Amanpour, where they asked me if I told a story about not favoring a ceasefire, and I got some anguished and some angry letters about how could you not favor a ceasefire when all these people are dying, which I completely understand, because it's heartbreaking to see what's going on in Gaza. And if you're not heartbroken about it, then you need your heart checked. But this lesson from Jewish history is a pretty powerful one, which is if you don't demonstrate overwhelming force, if you are kind to the cruel, as the Talmud has it, eventually you'll be cruel to the kind. If you don't demonstrate overwhelming force, then you are inviting another attack, especially when, by the way, your enemies have said explicitly that they would do it again and again and again, which the head of Hamas said with no self-consciousness at all. He said, we're going to have October 7th again and again and again and again and again. So that's lesson number one, I think, of Hanukkah, is that internecine warfare is dangerous because it weakens military preparedness. And the Maccabees won, but it was a close run thing. And had the Jews been more unified at the time, they would have had a much better shot. And certainly, I think it is true that the discord in Israel contributed to the sense from Israel's enemies that this was a good time to attack. I'm not who's responsible for the discord. Decide for yourself. I'm not going to the politics of it. That's for another time when I'm not being recorded. So that's one. The assimilation part is really powerful in Jewish history because there are two different, I want to identify, there are multiple strands of assimilation. I mean, in some ways you could say all of us are assimilated. We all dress like Americans. We all speak English. We all on and on and on and on. Lots of ways we're assimilated to American life. But I want to identify two particular kinds of assimilation that I think were much more what the Maccabees were fighting against. One is the assimilation that believes that you can essentially abandon Jewish culture. That's one. And we do know throughout Jewish history that there have been Jews that have left Judaism, and many never, I mean, they disappear into the fabric of history. Some of them in these sort of miraculous rediscoveries, after generations, all of a sudden, like they discover they do 23andMe and they find out that their great-great-grandmother was Jewish, and they rediscover their heritage. I get letters from people from time to time about that, and suddenly they're Jewish again. But there's another kind of assimilation that is an assimilation where what matters to you more than anything else is that you be seen as a Jew who is entirely ideologically aligned with the people around you. And here, I'm going to reveal, I said there'd be no politics, but here are my politics. Here, I'm thinking actually about those Jews who are anti-Zionists or a-Zionist. By a-Zionist, I mean they don't care one way or the other about the state of Israel, or they're anti-Zionists. And they make common cause with people who are ostensibly enemies because they want to say, no, we Jews too are part of this enterprise. And that is an assimilation against your origins that is very powerful these days, and especially among younger people, very widespread. And so at all of these campus protests, as you all know, heartbreakingly, there are Jews who are taking part in the pro-Palestinian protests, and they are doing it in their own mind for idealistic reasons. I think that they're wrong and deceived, but they think they're doing it for idealistic reasons, and that's a different kind of assimilation from the assimilation of indifference. And then thirdly, Jewish resilience and survival. Here, I want to make a couple of points about the predicament that we're in. One is that you should be aware that Jewish presence on campus is still real, and there are still, Hillel houses and Chabad houses and Jewish studies programs and all those things. And a lot of Jewish students move around the various campuses with relative ease and comfort. And I wear a kippah all around Harvard. Nobody's ever said anything unkind to me so far. So there is a certain resilience of people who just go about their business being Jews and assume that they will be able to do so. And part of the reason that I think that is so is something that Jews discount, which is Jews actually have a lot of friends. We are very used to, from history, we think the whole world's against us. The whole world is not against us. If the whole world was against us, we wouldn't be here. There are many, many, many people who are well-wishers in every community, and certainly in America, but not only in America. And when I, for example, marched in the parade, in the anti-Semitism parade in London, the two people standing next to me were not Jewish, and they were there just because they wanted to support the Jewish community and the Jewish people. And it was really quite beautiful. So that's one of the things that's worth remembering as part of Jewish resilience, is the ability to identify, to cultivate, and to thank and elevate others who are friends. That's part of our task. The other part of our task is to be able to identify those who are not friends. And one of the things that the Maccabees tell us is there are certain strains of anti-Jewish ideology that can't be reasoned with, they have to be fought. And we who live in a country where generally that's not the attitude, we have to be aware of how fragile Jewish life is in so many parts of the world, even if it's not here. And last night I was recording a podcast with Sam Harris, who is a podcaster with whom I've actually had debates about atheism. But we didn't debate about atheism on this podcast. Hasn't come out yet, but it will come out soon, I assume. And he said, what did American Jews learn about Israel because of all this? And I said, actually, we both learned about each other. American Jews learned that they're actually much more tied to Israel than they thought they were. You know, there are a lot of people on campus who didn't think all that much about Israel, and all of a sudden they were part of this great narrative, and not only on campus, I mean, everywhere in America, they're part of this great narrative, and they have to take positions on things that they didn't really think they had to take positions on, but now they do, because people would say to them, how do you feel about the Gaza war? Because you're Jewish. I said, but Israeli Jews also learned something, which was really remarkable and in many ways beautiful, and that is that they're tied to the diaspora. They didn't know, a lot of them, I've spoken to a lot of Israelis, they said, you know, we have no consciousness how much Jews in the diaspora are affected by what goes on in Israel. Because we've lived here for so long, we just thought, okay, look, the Jews, they live their nice lives in, you know, Los Angeles and New York and Chicago and Miami, and maybe you could go and visit them, and on tour, you know, you can see there, but we're different and we're separate, and we're Israelis. We're not Jews, we're Israelis. And I heard that many times from people in Israel. And now all of a sudden, guess what? You're Jews. And when things happen on American soil, they understand that those things are happening because of events in Israel, and that there is this cord that ties Jews together, not only in America, all over the world. I mean, why are all these Jews marching? As I said, I was in London. Why are all these Jews marching in London? Because of Israel. And when Israelis see that, I think it is surprising and heartening for them to know that actually we are part of this worldwide community. And I think it's heartening for us as well to know that we're part of this worldwide community, and that going forward, that might be one of the changes that actually comes about as a result of this, is something of a shift in consciousness about how much Israel is a cord that ties the two of us together. So I want to be able to I want to end up with two comments, and then I see that already some questions are coming in. So first of all, the holiday of Hanukkah is a really wonderful time for Jews to be able to assert who they are in the context not only of Israel, but also of the diaspora, because it's an easily understood holiday. You don't need a lot of complicated Jewish theology to understand it, because it is about Jewish self-assertion and about bringing light into the world. And also it's obviously closeness to Christmas makes it something that the non-Jewish world automatically notices and takes care of. I'm going to leave, by the way, the discussion of anti-Semitism for the questions afterwards, because I'm already getting questions about anti-Semitism. I promise I'll get to that. But then the other thing I want to say is, on the Zoom, I was on a Zoom with a bunch of Jewish scholars and leaders and so on and so forth. And I said to them, I'm about to do a class on Hanukkah. Anything you think I should say? And one of them, Shuki Taylor, great guy, said, yes, tell them next year we'll be saying Al Hanisim, which means on the miracles, the prayer that you say for Hanukkah. He said, tell them that next year we'll be saying Al Hanisim on what happened this year. And I thought, that's a beautiful prayer in a way. That is a beautiful prayer, to think that this year miracles will come about, that next year we will remember. And I hope that that's true. Okay, that's the end of the formal. Let me talk about one or two. Let me talk about two of the questions I got, and then I'll invite others. One is, what can one do to help Jews see themselves? Other than like just slap them and say, what is wrong with you? Why can't you see yourself? That probably wouldn't work. I think that the best way to help anyone come to any realization is to begin by listening to them about where they are and to ask them questions about it. Because in my own experience, we constantly talk for victory, and it almost never works. You go into a conversation because you're going to convince the other person, because you're so convinced yourself, you're going to convince the other person of this. And so in my favorite line that I quote all the time by Joseph Epstein, Jews don't listen, they wait. You know, you're just waiting for that person to finish what they're saying so that you can tell them what they should think. And I think the way you get people to see themselves is by first understanding how they actually see themselves and listening to them, and then asking more questions so that you really understand where they're from and you're not speaking to them from your vantage point, which they don't share. The second question was, should we hide our identity in these dangerous times? And I absolutely not. First of all, let's not exaggerate. You know, there has been very little physical danger to Jews in America. I mean, I look at Harvard, everybody talks about Harvard all the time. One kid got shoved. In terms of actual physical danger, that's what happened, right? All the other stuff has been psychological and so on, and it's been serious and it's been bad. And I'm certainly not suggesting that nothing is happening, but we are not in physical danger by and large in America. Are there any physical dangers? Yes. I mean, is there Poway? Is there Tree of Life in Pittsburgh? Are there isolated attacks? Yes, just like there are isolated attacks in schools, but you don't tell your kids not to go to school. So I completely reject the idea that you have to hide who you are as a Jew to be safe in the United States. It's just not true, I think. That doesn't mean it could never be true, although I'm pretty optimistic on that front, but it certainly is not true now. And so I don't, yes, for the question about whether I've had the opportunity to speak to President Gay, we spoke quite a bit when I was on the anti-Semitism panel in particular. We met twice a week. We met with the president. She is well aware of our feelings about it. And I think she understands it. And we'll see what happens. I'm not going to make any predictions about the future. I have no idea what will happen at Harvard. But she certainly knows how the people on the anti-Semitism committee feel. What's the next one? What did Jews think about Hindus and India? Great question. Let me say something about Hindus in India, even though it's not so Hanukkah, but it's interesting for the following reason. India has almost no history of anti-Semitism. And one of the reasons why India has almost no history of anti-Semitism is there are very few Jews in India, right? I mean, if you go to Kerala, to Cochin, and you walk down Jews Lane, there, you know, where Jews used to live, it's still a tiny part of India. And Hindus, who after all have millions of gods, really don't care if somebody else has one too. It's not like your God is competing with my God. As far as they're concerned, you know, you want another God? Have another God. And also, there's been a lot of work done by Alan Brill and also by Alon Goshen Gottstein, if you're interested, on Judaism and Hinduism. And there are some remarkable parallels between the two traditions, but I turn you to them for better consideration of it. Now, in terms of Jewish views of Hindu theology, since they have millions of gods, my own understanding is that it's kind of, that it's not so clear cut. That they're having millions of gods doesn't necessarily mean that they don't think that there is one force that splits into many different forces in some ways, There, you would have to ask somebody who has much more expertise in Hindu theology than I do. But I will also say that in my own experience, at least right now, it was not always true, but right now, India is very supportive of Israel. And for that, we have to be grateful. It wasn't true some time ago. It wasn't true in the Indira Gandhi era when India was much more of a quasi-Marxist state, but it is true now. So anyway, okay, I see another. And by the way, it's not quite coming through. Let me see if I can see it on the screen. It's in the chat. Okay. I appreciate your asking. The deliberations of this. Someone asked what was expressed to her and what was her response in the anti-Semitism committee. All the deliberations of the anti-Semitism committee are confidential, and so I can't comment on that. And please don't literally don't read anything into that, because no matter what you would have said, it would be confidential. That's just, I won't tell you what the other members said. In fact, yesterday, I was sitting with a reporter from a well-known paper who asked me 12 different ways, what did the anti-Semitism committee say? And finally, I said to her, look, I was a synagogue rabbi for 26 years. I'm really good at keeping things confidential when someone tells me to keep them confidential. I said, I'm just not going to tell you. And she said, okay, well, I thought I had to try. So anyway, I will say this, though, about the situations at these universities. Don't think for a minute that the situation at any of these universities is a result of the president of the university. This has been going on for a long time. And this is a deeply entrenched culture. And adding someone or getting rid of someone will not solve it. It's going to take much more than that. And it's going to take an enormous amount of work and an enormous amount of time and a great deal of unlearning. And we're going to have to change our conception of what DEI is and intersectionality and colonialist settlers, and all the apparatus of ideological muck that has accumulated over many years, while still acknowledging that there is genuine prejudice and racism and classism and other things in American society, like there are in all societies in different ways, that make it much easier for some people to have a good life than for other people to have a good life. And so you have to be able to address inequalities without seeing the entire world solely through the lens of this person's higher, this person's lower, this person's oppressed, this person isn't, this person is this color of skin, and this person is that color of skin. Those kinds of sort of very hard cut categories are just inadequate for the human experience. So I can't see, someone put some words in the chat. It's much too small for me to see. So, but the question is, how do you deal with friends and coworkers who aren't anti-Semitic but misinformed and outraged about Palestinian casualties and blame Israel? I think that the best you can probably do is have them listen to some material. I would have them listen to maybe someone like on Dan Senior's podcast, have them listen to Douglas Murray. Ask them to listen to one podcast. That would be a really good podcast to listen to. Because after all, any of us seeing the casualties in Gaza, if it were not Gaza, if it were any other place, we would say that's terrible, that's horrible, how could that be? And it takes some real understanding and some real background to know that despite the fact that the casualties are terrible, the attacks are unfortunately essential. I don't know. I don't think the Quran actually calls for the end of Israel. It certainly calls for, at least at the end of time, for the murder of Jews. And what I would say is, look, all the sacred books have some very difficult stuff in them. I mean, Christianity, God knows, partly because there were family quarrels. Like Muhammad wanted the Jews to convert and they didn't, and he got upset. The authors of the Gospels wanted the Jews to accept Jesus and they didn't, and they got upset. And then it gets put in a sacred book and it lasts forever. And it takes, as I said, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time to try to untangle those threads. The one thing that I will say is no religion is always one thing forever, right? If you had told our great, great, great grandparents in Poland and Russia and Lithuania, and Latvia and Estonia and all those countries, that one day we would live in a Christian country with perfectly equal rights with Christians and no distinction between Christians and Jews in the eyes of the law or society, they would have said, you're crazy, that will never happen. It hasn't happened for thousands of years. What makes you think that'll happen? So things can change, and I am hopeful that the toxic ideology of the Islamists in particular will change, but it's not going to change tomorrow. The same thing with all of this dialogue is a process of dialogue. And it's going to take a lot of time. And you have to be both persistent and also have some degree of optimism, because we have seen how people who we thought would never change their minds have changed their minds, right? The Catholic Church doesn't teach what it used to teach. And are there still Christian anti-Semites? Yeah, there are plenty of them, but not compared to what there were 100 years ago. And so it is possible. And in terms of the current situation leading to peace in Israel, I could actually imagine it in many, many different ways. Again, we are incapable of envisioning how much things can change in history that we think cannot change. The Soviet Union suddenly collapses. Who would have thought that all these Eastern European satellites could become thriving democracies, which some of them are, not all of them, but some of them are. The fact that people say they will fight forever, the French and the English said they would fight forever, and now they're the French and the English, right? They fought for hundreds and hundreds of years. So all I can say is I can't exactly give you a path, but I know from history that assuming that people will never change is a mistake. Sometimes that may be true, but look at Germany. Germany is, to Jews, is the friendliest country in the world. And that would have been more than inconceivable in 1943. That's part of the ideology, obviously, of trying to inflict a massive defeat, as people might think our strategy is unproductive and we have to change it. But look, I am not a political analyst. I can't tell you for sure what the future is going to be. That's just the best I can do. And what are the best ways to bridge how about present on campus? I don't know which campus we're talking about. Smaller university. Oh, I see. So yeah, smaller universities, I think you have to go to the administration and you have to make a case for what's going on. And you have to also, by the way, endow programs that will promote Jewish life and decency. And Jews have to start supporting those colleges that support them. There are other colleges out there besides the Ivy Leagues, and I was at an event in New York about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, and I was on a panel that included Bret Stephens from the New York Times, and he said, I have only this to say to the Jewish people: Muhlenberg. Now, Muhlenberg is a small college in Pennsylvania, and he said, there are all these colleges that would love Jewish minds and Jewish kids and Jewish resources, and they would support you and they would help you. He said, stop giving your money to places that don't want it. Give it to Muhlenberg. But he didn't necessarily mean Dafka Mueller, that's the only one. He was using it as an example. I'm going down, for example, I'll give a free advertisement for a different college. How about that? A college I have never been to, but I know the president, and he's a fantastic guy, not Jewish. He is German. He's doing everything he can to support the Jewish students on campus, and he wants more. And he's bringing me down there to talk to them, and that is Vanderbilt. He wants Vanderbilt to be a place where Jewish students come and feel like they are supported and safe, and they can have civil dialogues with students, because he has Muslim students too, but they're going to have civil dialogues. They're not going to scream at each other, and they're not going to intimidate each other. And I think that maybe people are starting new universities. Barry Weiss is starting a new university in Austin, along with a bunch of other people, with Joe Lonsdale and others. I think that people are starting to believe that, the American higher education system is let 1,000 flowers bloom. It doesn't only have to be, and I know, we all know that you can actually have a very successful life, even if you don't go to the top college. That's not actually what does it in the end. I'm gonna actually close my discussion with my Uber driver. So, unless you have a particular other, the son of a cousin right now is a Vanderbilt and Orthodox Jew. That is good to know. So I'm with my Uber driver, and he says to me, so what do you do? And I said, I'm a visiting scholar. He says, where? I said, Harvard. He said, how do I get into Harvard? So I said, look, I'm not on the admissions committee. I've been there for 2.5 months. I'm not sure I'm the best person to ask. I said, but I'll tell you like what I think, which is, I said, they're always, Harvard, like every college, is looking for people who do different sorts of things from what everyone does. I said, if you have like the highest GPA in your class and you play the violin, that won't necessarily get you into Harvard, because that describes like 50% of the people who apply. I said, but if you do something different, something unique, they don't have that many, whatevers, that was a chance. And then I said to him, but also I want to tell you something else. If you're driven and you're persistent and you're ambitious and you're going to work, you will succeed. Doesn't matter where you go in this country. If you're all those things, I don't know anyone who's focused and driven and persistent and keeps at it and doesn't eventually find a measure of success, sometimes a great measure of success. And there's a certain point in your life where nobody asks you anymore where you went to college. That's not anymore the relevant question. It's like, what you do with your life? What do you do with your life? Who are you? So there is, I understand that like the emphasis on the meritocracy is a little bit overdrawn. But now I'm going to conclude with the exact opposite message. Having said that, I also think it's really important to save the institutions that have great heritage and great learning and many like resources and professors and students of great ability. And that's one of the reasons to stay and work at it, because these places need to be reformed and they need to be saved because they're very important. Someone said to me the other day, granted that this was someone at Harvard, I grant you, was actually an important official, past official at Harvard. He said, Harvard is the most important NGO in the United States, non-government organization. And I thought he might be right. He might be right. And if that's true, then it's important to try to help it become sane again. And so on this Hanukkah, let's all hope for a miracle. And thank you so much for attending today and for joining me. And all I can say is, for those of you who are watching from beyond, this was a class for Sinai Temple, and talk about fantastic places with amazing people and a great history and God willing, an even better future. Sinai Temple in Los Angeles. When you're in Los Angeles, come visit and pray with us. And